I'm Dan Rodricks, and you're listening to Midday. When Marlin Briscoe stepped onto the field for the Denver Broncos against the Cincinnati Bengals in October 1968, he became the first black starting quarterback in professional football. Briscoe broke the color barrier on a position that had excluded blacks for decades. Norman Davis, a diversity consultant and career coach, joins us to take a look at the challenges faced by Marlin Briscoe as well as other professional pioneers. From the first Jewish student at a Catholic college to pioneering black fire chiefs, Norman Davis examines what it means to be the first of a kind and how this affects performance in the workplace. The Black Quarterback Syndrome, on Midday after the news. And welcome to our second hour of Midday today. Dan Rodricks here. Thanks again for joining us and making Midday part of your day on WYPR. I said I had a couple of emails I wanted to read that are left over from the previous hour. This one from Mark in Govans, who says, whenever I hear a caller on a talk show state that he's willing to pay higher taxes, I respond in my head, go ahead. Nothing's stopping you. No law forces you to take every deduction, but that's not what the caller really means. He should say, I'm willing to pay higher taxes so long as everyone else who earns at least as much as me has to pay them too. That is the true message. The implicit message is that government will do better things with the money than each individual will. It's an argument that people are stupid and government is smart. All the while, the proponent makes himself look altruistic and generous. If the caller really felt that he could give up some of his income to improve the lives of others, there are thousands of charities that would gladly fulfill his ostensible goal. Robin, writing to us at midday at wypr.org, says, the UK government has recently raised taxes on the wealthy to 50%. They have also capped tax-free pension contributions. However, they are giving tax breaks for the wealthy who invest in new entrepreneurial ventures. This has increased the availability of investment money and is set to grow the economy. Also, Patricia, writing in Baltimore, if tax cuts provided jobs, there would be 2 jobs for every American by now. If you have comments for anything you hear on our show today, again, our email address, midday@wypr.org. You can also post comments on our Facebook page, the Dan Rodricks Facebook page, or the WYPR Facebook page. In 1968, Marlin Briscoe became the first black quarterback to start a professional football game. 1968. In that year, Marlin Briscoe set a Denver Broncos rookie passing record, completing 14 touchdown passes in 11 games. Marlin Briscoe was traded the next year, but his groundbreaking venture into quarterback stardom allowed for generations of black quarterbacks to follow. In his new book, The Black Quarterback Syndrome, Norman Davis takes a look at the adversity faced by Marlin Briscoe and what his experience means for other pioneers in industry, in the professions, in the workplace, in academia, in all walks of life. From the lone white members of an all-black basketball team to the first female bus drivers, Norman Davis examines what it means to be the first of a kind and how the pressures faced by these pioneers far exceed the demands placed on average workers. I'm pleased to be joined first by Norman Davis, who is a professor of management at Albertus Magnus College in New Haven, Connecticut, and author of The Black Quarterback Syndrome, How to Succeed as a First or Pioneer in an Organization. Norman Davis, nice to have you here.
Dan, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for visiting our studio. Great. And it's a great pleasure you brought to us. We get a chance to speak with Marlin Briscoe today. Mr. Briscoe, thank you, and welcome to WYPR in Baltimore.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great.
Hi, magician.
The magician. Marlin the magician, who I remember mostly from his days with the Miami Dolphins and, of course, that great 17-0 undefeated 1972 Dolphins team that went to the Super Bowl, won the Super Bowl. But I want to go back to 68, Marlin Briscoe, for the benefit of our listeners who aren't familiar with that year in your life and what happened. And I just went over it briefly there. Please tell us the story. How did you become had you been a quarterback in high school or college?
Well, actually, I was a quarterback in my entire life, starting from Pop Warner League, flag football on the playground, high school, college. Quarterback was a position that I had always cherished, and that was a position that I had always played.
But when you got to the pros, let's see, I have you as 5'10", 177 pounds in 1968. Is that right?
Yes, but I was 6'3", 210 on Sunday.
How did you get drawn into playing quarterback in that?
Well,
season?
Denver drafted me in the 14th round as a defensive back, and my head coach at the time, collegiate coach Al Coniglia, he had some experience with the NFL, and he had some information that Denver was one of the only teams in the league that held their practices in view of the fans and the media. And he suggested that I put in the contract that I had to get a 3-day trial at quarterback just to have a forum to exhibit whatever skills he thought I had. And I negotiated my own contract, and in that contract, those were stipulations. Well, they thought I was crazy because how could a 14th round draft choice dictate to a powerful entity like the NFL or the Denver Broncos his own contract demands? Well, they really wanted me to play for them, and so they acquiesced to my so-called demands and gave me that 3-day trial. And during the 3-day trial, I had a great camp. And so I did what I needed to do in front of the media, in front of the fans there in Denver, to get my abilities out there. And after the 3-day trial, I was rushed back to the defensive cornerback, actually, and I was starting at the time until I got hurt. But during that 3-day exhibition, there were 8 quarterbacks in camp, and of course, I was the last one to get to go through the several drills that they had: short throws, medium throws, long throws. And I knew it was not going to be a level playing field, and that I would have to perform better than the others in each of those situations. And I did so. And when all the other quarterbacks failed, Steve Tensley got hurt, and the other 7 quarterbacks that were in that 3-day trial got an opportunity but failed. The media and the fans remembered me from that 3-day trial and said, why don't you give the little guy from Omaha a chance? And he was the best one in camp. And I was coming off a hamstring injury, and they needed some production from the quarterback position. And I got back to my locker one day thinking that I was cut because I saw the number 15 in my locker, and Lou Saban told me that today, my friend, that was his term for his players, you are a quarterback. And my leg got healed, and my heart started pumping, and it was a glorious day for me, and that's how so-called history was made.
I think it's important for people to understand at that time. The reason I asked you about college and whether you had played quarterback in college, and maybe Norm Davis, you can help us with this too. It's 1968. There are black men playing football in the AFL and the NFL before the 2 leagues merged. Were there black quarterbacks other than at the historically black colleges? Can you say, Marlin or Norm?
Well, I made All-American in college, and it was kind of funny because James Harris, who eventually became my roommate at Buffalo in 1969.
He had gone to Grambling, right?
He had gone to Grambling, and when he met me, he thought that I was white because of my name and obviously because of the college that I attended,
Nebraska,
Omaha University. And so did a lot of other people. They thought that because of my situation in coaching, playing at a predominantly white school, that I must have been white. And to his surprise, when he met me, he found out that I was black. But I mean, before he met me, of course, obviously when I played at Denver. But I had great success in college. Made several All-American teams, including first-team Black All-American with O.J. Simpson and Leroy Keys and that group.
But what I'm getting at is on the quarterback specifically. At that time, Norm Davis, there weren't that many, were there?
Well, no. Historically, there have always been a few black quarterbacks that would creep through. And there was even another quarterback, I think, from Michigan State, who years ago, Willie Thrower, even played pro football, but it was only after the quarterback on the Chicago Bears got hurt and they put him in the game, and as quarterback, he never played again. But I think what we've had over the years is, particularly back in those days, was there were very few black quarterbacks. And think about this. How many black players decided they wouldn't even try to play quarterback, and they would go ahead and allowed themselves to be steered into running back, defensive back, or some other position like that?
That's what I want to get at, the why of that. And the why of that is what? The white coaches, the white owners of teams?
I'll leave that one for Marlin to answer.
Go ahead.
Although I have my own opinion, of course. But I think it matches. I think it's pretty close. We've talked.
But first of all, I should not have been the first black starting quarterback in the NFL. There was Sandy Stevens, Wilburn Howells, Jimmy Ray. There were, black quarterbacks before me that obviously had the talent to play the position on the next level, but were not given an opportunity. And the thing that the league and management would throw out there is that, oh, he's such a great athlete, he can play another position. So they would always use that excuse to change black quarterbacks to different positions because they deemed them, exceptional athletes. Now, the Fran Tarkentons of the world, the Bob Greaseys, they never got switched to another position because of their athleticism. But we black quarterbacks did. And I think that was an excuse that they used to really mask the fact that they didn't want a black to play quarterback.
What drew you to Marlin Briscoe's story? I mean, he was the first here, Norm Davis.
Yes.
But what about it? In the work that you've done over the years, what about this story drew you to? What drew you to this story?
Well, first I was drawn to Marlin's book because Marlin and I were in college together at the same college, and I knew his story and his life. Mm-hmm. But it was around 1972, something like that. I was watching the news, and it said, lo and behold, that there's the first starting black quarterback for Denver Broncos, and they mentioned Marlin's names, and I was floored. I thought I just assumed Marlin had been, one, that he wasn't even playing pro football. If he was, he'd be playing some other position than quarterback. So in the early 2000s, 2002, something like that, I heard that Marlin had a book out. I read Marlin's book, and when I read Marlin's book, it reinforced many of the opinions that I had reached, that there was such a thing that I called the black quarterback syndrome in corporate America. That is, people would look at you if you were not like all the others that went before, if you didn't look like the prototype, the model, that type of thing there, they would look at you with doubt. And they just weren't accustomed to seeing people like you, whether it was a woman, the first openly gay person, the only white male on that all black basketball team. Whenever you don't fit the prototype, people doubt you, and I saw that.
So you wondered what that experience was like for the person going through it,
right,
and those around them as well.
Right. So I began to do some research. I asked Marlin to come out to New Haven and speak to my college about his book. And after I heard Marlin talk about his book, I thought, my goodness, I was writing another book at the time. I thought, I've got to write this story because there's such similarity between the playing field that he was on, which was football, and the corporate America playing field that I've been on, that I've observed, and so forth.
Well, let's do this, Norm Davis and Marlin Briscoe. Let's invite others into this conversation today. We sent out a message earlier on Twitter saying, Were you the first minority or woman in your workplace in general, or in a specific position in a workplace, in an office, in an agency of some kind, in a corporation? We'd like to hear from you. Tell us about your experience. 410-662-8780 is the phone number for Midday. 866-661-9309 is toll-free from anywhere in the United States. You can also send your story in by email, but keep it brief, midday@wypr.org. Marlin Briscoe was the first black quarterback in professional football, and Norm Davis is a diversity consultant and the author of the how-to book, The Black Quarterback Syndrome, in which he examines the challenges faced by Marlin Briscoe and others who are pioneers in their profession. We'll be right back. I'm looking at a photograph of Marlin Briscoe from 1968 with the Denver Broncos. We posted it on our Facebook page. It's a beautiful uniform too, isn't it? It's the orange pants, the big D on the blue helmet.
Is he left-handed?
But yeah, he looks left-handed to me. Marlin Briscoe, were you? I'm laughing. You're laughing. Were you left-handed?
No, I thought you were going to say I had the striped socks too. I wasn't that old.
No, you got the modern socks there, but. Am I right? Are you throwing left-handed?
No, I'm throwing right-handed, but I could throw left-handed.
You know what? That photograph could be reversed. Sometimes they reverse those photographs. Wait a minute, I'm looking. No, he's right-handed in this picture.
Yeah, I'm right-handed.
You're right-handed. What I wanted to ask you, as we proceed with this conversation, about adversity. I'm sure you've been asked about this before. You must have felt, first of all, the whole world was watching you, certainly all of Denver, and then you were on television, of course, and here's the first black quarterback. That keeps getting repeated. My question is, how did the other players respond around you?
Well, they were absolutely supportive of me. I never looked at myself as a black quarterback on any level. I just was a quarterback that happened to be black, but I never let that deter me. And we were talking about 1968, which was it was a tumultuous time in black history, civil rights history, and so certainly there was a lot of eyes upon me that day, October 6, 1968. But I never really let that color bother me. And I went out on that field and just like I did in college, and proved that I could be a leader. And when I came to Denver in 1968, the majority of the linemen, the offensive linemen particularly, were white. And a lot of those guys came from Ole Miss. They came from Alabama. They came from Tennessee. And when they were in college, not only did they not had the opportunity to play for a black quarterback, they didn't play with black players, period, until they got to the pros. So it was challenging, to say the least, that I proved to those not only white players but black players as well that a black quarterback could think, throw, and lead at that level. And I see these guys at Denver Bronco reunions, and they come up to me, to a man, and says, we could have won with you. They can say that now, but they couldn't say it back then because management and coaching staff, they wanted you to play football, not have an opinion of anything else but football. But those guys, they stood behind me, both black and white, and the offensive line, they would always say, don't let them touch the magician. So that in itself was a huge hurdle. See, one thing about management, they thought that having a black as a quarterback would have an effect on how the players would play for you, how the fans would react to you, how management would react. And they thought it was, the naysayers said that it would be a negative effect. But in retrospect, it was the complete opposite. And so I think if I have a legacy at that position, and although it was only for 1 year, is that, all of those myths were dispelled, and the black quarterbacks that came after me, although they had their problems, the James Harrises, the Warren Moons, the Doug Williams, Jefferson Street Joe, to name a few, at least they got the opportunity. At least the eyes were open that, hey, these guys can play the position. Now let's get them on the field at the talent level that they have to play in quarterback and not switch them. And so, I'm very proud of that.
Okay. Marlin Briscoe speaking to us today on the phone. This is Midday on WYPR. In Baltimore, Marlin Briscoe was the first black quarterback in professional football, playing for the Denver Broncos in 1968. First starting quarterback, I should say. He went on to become a member of the 1972 undefeated Super Bowl champion Miami Dolphins. Joining me in Studio A is Norman Davis, who's a professor of management at Albertus Magnus College in New Haven and author of The Black Quarterback Syndrome, How to Succeed as a First or Pioneer in an Organization. As you're listening to Marlin Briscoe describe his experience there in terms of his teammates and the fans, the whole culture in Denver in 1968, some of that resonate with the other folks that you interviewed for this book?
It very much does, Dan. In private industry, we have management who also doubted and wondered if a woman could be a lawyer. Could she be tough enough? Could she negotiate? We have situations where blacks, Latinos, Asians, and so forth were doubted as to whether or not they wanted to be managers, would they be strong enough, capable enough, and so forth. Now, it's hard to believe that at this point in time in 2011, but there are some positions even today. I mean, we have our first black president, and you still see a lot of doubting. I mean, there's about the President Obama's capabilities. I think that is some of that is natural. It's human behavior. Listen, here's an example. I have a friend who has since died, but he used to tell the story about a friend of his who was black. And this guy in the late 1960s, early 1970s, got on an airplane, was about to take his seat when he heard the roar of the engine. He turned to his left, looked into the cockpit. Now, the guy I'm talking about is black himself. He looked into the cockpit, and there was a black pilot. He said his heart dropped, and he thought to himself, I hope this brother can fly this plane. Now, is that racism? I don't think that's racism. I think what that is conditioning. We've all been conditioned by looking at people in different kinds of positions. We're just not accustomed to seeing an airplane pilot who is black. An airplane pilot, if you think about the prototype, think about it. What do they look like? Well, most of them are white. They're tall. They're pretty slim, gray hair in the temples. Remember that guy, Sully Sullenberger?
Right.
That did that, the Miracle on the Hudson?
He was from Central Casting, I would say.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And by the way, my nephew was on that plane.
Oh, really?
It was quite a night for our family. But my point is, if you don't look like the prototype, people may question you immediately. So you really have to work hard. It doesn't mean that they believe you won't make it, but there's some proving you have to do. So the people.
And if you go back to 1968,
absolutely,
when Marlin Briscoe is stepping up as a quarterback for the Denver Broncos, that's certainly
even blacks might
shocking to people, right? To see a black man
exactly.
lean down, take the snap from the center, because they had been all white faces doing that before that.
Exactly. In my book, I talk about how emotional it was for me when he would throw a pass. And the analyst on TV might criticize any black quarterback that it was too high, too low. And it felt to me, I felt very sensitive and perhaps even overly sensitive, which can be part of the syndrome. Now, by me using this term prototype, I don't mean to suggest that there was no such thing as racism, because there was. And there still is, but I think what I'm introducing with this black quarterback syndrome is that all of the doubt is not necessarily racism, sexism, homophobia, and what Marlin and I are teaming up to give presentations around the country on this, using his historical moment and bringing it forward with the fact that we don't want it just to be a piece of history. We want people to realize there are many people right now today who are still first and among the first. If you're the second, third, or fourth, and I call them pioneers, if you're in a position where you don't look like the prototype, you still have challenges. And my book talks about 12 specific things that you can do in order to succeed, as well as the people who are Marlin's teammates. You know, Steve Tinsley's. There are Steve Tinsley's in organizations today that can help that first, second, or third person be successful. As Marlin tells in his book that Steve Tinsley actually supported and helped him.
He was the quarterback he subbed for.
That's correct.
Who was injured.
One of them.
Perspective and advice for women and minorities who are still breaking barriers, and for coworkers who want to support them. And we'd like to hear your experiences if you were a first someplace in the working world out there. 410-662-8780. Norman Davis, is there a reluctance on the part of people like Marlin Briscoe when they're in the moment, when it's happening to them, when they're the pioneer, to actually talk about it?
I think there is, and from the people that I interviewed, they would say that no. If someone were to ask you about the challenges, you keep that pretty low profile. And even in my book, I talk about the point where Willie Randolph, the coach for the New York Mets at the time.
Who's now with the Orioles.
Is he with the
He's
Orioles
with the Orioles now?
Oh,
Yeah.
my goodness. Mm-hmm. But anyway, at this particular time, Willie Randolph was the manager. They were losing, and he had to defend.
Excuse me, I just want to interject. He was the first black New York manager of any New York baseball team, I believe,
I
right?
believe so. He had been with the Yankees before him, but not the manager.
Not the
I think he
manager.
was a coach or something.
Okay, sorry.
So when Willie's team was losing, of course, they beat you up in New York, and I'm sure they do here in Baltimore, too, when you're losing. You've got to explain it. So he was, explaining, why things are going on and so forth and so on. Finally, someone mentioned race about the criticism that he got, and he says, well, I don't know. I can't put my finger on. Maybe there isn't. My God.
Maybe there
is.
some...
Maybe race is a factor here as to why I'm getting so much criticism. That was the implication. And wow, for the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, I went on vacation, came back, and
I remember
Sports
that.
Radio, they were still vilifying this guy.
That if he had been a white manager, the rhetoric that was used in criticizing him as manager of the Mets may not have been as strong.
That was the implication. Now, so I would advise people to not to acknowledge that there's extra pressure. Again, in my book, I talk about specific things that you can do to survive all that extra pressure.
Let me ask you this, Norm Davis and Marlin Briscoe. If you want to comment, please
Sure.
do. What about the idea that you're being used in an experiment? This may not be happening. It's probably still happening to some degree today, but in the 60s and 70s, all through the 80s, when women and minorities were breaking barriers, right? So they had an advocate in the workplace that wanted to give them an opportunity, right? So they put them in a position. Did they feel patronized? Did they feel like they were being used in an experiment and not appreciate that?
Well, if we take it again, and I like to use this and bring it back to organizations. If we look at Branch Rickey, he was the person that brought in Jackie Robinson, the first black Major League Baseball player with the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1948. Yes, he knew this was an experiment. He even talked to some of the players about what it was going to be like, but the players still didn't want Jackie on the team. It was very important that one of the onlookers, one of the team members, is Pee Wee Reese, walked over to second base on a particular day when things weren't going well for Jackie. The crowd was booing and so forth. And Pee Wee Reese put his arm around Jackie Robinson, and that was a turning point, so much so that it's remembered today, and there's a statue that's been erected down in Brooklyn memorializing that moment. It's important to have onlookers and supporters, just like Marlin had Steve Tinsley. I'm sure Marlin had other people. Marlin has told me about Jackie. Was it Jackie Kemp? Marlin wasn't.
Yeah, the Jack Kemp, the quarterback in Buffalo.
Yeah.
And other people have been supporters of Marlin in his career. Coach Caniglia back at Omaha. We all have supporters that help us get through.
Marlon, can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think it was out of desperation that I got an opportunity because Steve Tinsley had gone down, and the other quarterbacks obviously didn't play well enough for the Bronco fans and management. And because of the 3-day trial, I got an opportunity to play. After that, given that opportunity, I think I was a litmus test, so to speak, because I had to prove failure was not an option. We'll put it that way. Failure was not an option, and to get an opportunity, and that's what it's all about, opportunity, you have to succeed. And I think I did that.
I want to ask you this, Marlin Briscoe. After that season in Denver, when you were the starting quarterback, you were traded. How did that make you feel? And then also my second question is, did you play quarterback again after that?
Well, first of all, I wasn't traded. I was cut.
I'm sorry, you were cut by the Broncos and picked up by Buffalo?
By Buffalo. But
Okay.
what happened was I went back to finish up my degree. I lacked 6 hours. And while I was back in Omaha, I heard through the grapevine that Denver was having quarterback meetings, and I wasn't even invited. They had acquired Pete Lisk from Canada, and, they didn't even invite me to the meetings. Well, I took a secretive plane, so to speak, back to Denver and went into the office, and here comes Steve Tensley, Pete Lisk, and Hunter Ennis, who was the quarterback coach, and Lou Saban coming out of one of their meetings, and they couldn't even look me in the eye. And, of course, Steve, he was apologetic, but he had nothing to do with it. And so I knew at that point that I was not going to get an opportunity to compete. Now, I went into the 1969 season just wanting to compete. I didn't feel that they should hand me the starting job. I just wanted to compete. Obviously, that was not going to happen. So I asked for my release because I thought other teams would be interested. Well, they told me, we'll give you a release, wait 4 days. And I waited the 4 days. After 4 days, nobody would touch me. And so obviously there was a blackball situation involved. And so I went up to Canada for 1 day. Didn't really like Canadian football. No disrespect to their brand of ball. I just felt that I belonged in the NFL. So I started calling around to other teams. Obviously, they didn't want me as a quarterback, but they wanted to give me a tryout at different positions. And I knew that if I was going to stay in the NFL, that I would have to switch positions. John Rauch, who previous year was the head coach with the Raiders. I almost beat the Raiders, so he knew that I could play the game. He brought me in as a wide receiver. I got enough time to make the transition, and the rest was history.
And you went on later to play with the Miami Dolphins. Marlin Briscoe, our guest, along with Norman Davis, is the author of The Black Quarterback Syndrome, How to Succeed as a First or Pioneer in an Organization, what it means to be the first of a kind in a profession. If you have questions for our guests or want to offer your personal experience as a pioneer, please give us a call, 410-662-8780, 866-661-9309. I have an email here from Alexandra telling us her story about being the first female executive in the National Brewing Company in Baltimore. I'll read that when we come back. Alexandra's email. In the 1960s, I was hired as marketing projects manager in the National Brewing Company, the first female executive there, and perhaps the entire brewing industry. It took chutzpah, creativity, and a certain amount of tolerance, patience, and charm to overcome the comments and recalcitrance of my fellow executives those first long months. I worked hard, suffered a few slings and arrows, and finally created several of my own projects that included a cooking with beer cookbook that won awards, a cooking with beer contest at the Maryland State Fair, and a slideshow that I use as a marketing tool in all our markets from Baltimore to Detroit to Phoenix and Miami. I wound up loving the job, the men, and mostly the folks I met in my travels among beer drinkers. She says, the man who hired me, who was my boss, stated the day I was hired, if you sleep with any of your fellow executives, you're the one who will be fired, not them. Thank you for sharing that with us. Norm Davis, comments on those reflections?
Well, not only Alexandra, but many other women know that they feel extra pressure for lots of reasons. And I used to recruit lawyers for a major financial corporation. And I remember sending limousines to a particular school to bring this talented woman back. She was about to graduate from law school. We did everything we possibly could to hire her. Well, we did. And 2 years later, I saw her in a restaurant, and I said, "So how's the job going?" She said, "Oh, you didn't know? I left." She said, "It was just too much. They wanted me, but they gave me no support." Now, that's just one of the examples of the extra pressure, not getting the support. And if you were to interview and talk to some of the guys this law department had, let's say, 50, 60 lawyers, all of whom were male, except for, one or two. And if you were to ask, those male lawyers if they saw her differently or made work for her any more difficult, they would say, "Oh, absolutely not. In fact, we don't even notice that she's a woman." That's the response. And of course, that's not true either. They do notice. And by the way, they'll say, "Go make us some coffee and plan the party for next weekend."
Norm Davis is with us, and Marlin Briscoe is on the phone with us. The Black Quarterback Syndrome is the name of your book. When you use that word syndrome,
yes,
it sounds like a problem of some kind, a condition.
Well, and the word condition is part of the definition. A syndrome is a set of circumstances that do present a certain condition. And the condition that I refer to most often is doubt. They look at black people, young people, the only white male, or if you're a young white male wants to work for MTV, not a young white male, but a 55-year-old white male that wants to work for MTV, there you go. You are going to be looked at with doubt because you're too old, where the average age is about 25 to 30. They just don't think you've got the fresh thinking and the technological capabilities either.
Marlin Briscoe, one more question for you before we go to the phone lines and take some calls.
Sure.
Do you regret? Are you at all, when you look back, at all even a little bit bitter about not getting a chance to be a quarterback again in professional football?
Well, I wouldn't call it bitter, because if I was bitter, then I would not have rolled up my sleeves and switched positions and worked hard to overcome the disappointment. I think that's a better term that I felt, by not being able to continue my professional career as a quarterback. I thought I deserved that, at least the opportunity to compete and let the chips fall where they may. But James Harris used to say that I was bitter. He and I ironically became roommates in 1969, and I wasn't really bitter. And I keep telling James that. But disappointed? Yes, I was disappointed. I thought it was unfair, unjust, and of course, I think racism had a lot to do with it. But at least it gave the world an opportunity to see that a black man could man that position. He could do the job, both on and off the field, and that all negatives that came along with anybody giving a black man an opportunity to play that position, that those thoughts were eliminated, eradicated. So I'm glad that I was the one that was chosen for some reason to do the job.
Marlin Briscoe.
Can I just interject this?
Sure, quick.
As I listen to Marlin fits in so neatly with the people I interviewed. He has most of those same common traits that people that succeed who are first and pioneers.
How would you describe the common traits of a pioneer in this situation?
Intensely competitive, intensely desirous of achieving, not wounded too easily. Just because you get a little negative criticism, you don't give up. Marlin says he's not bitter. He didn't give up. And you believe in yourself. It's pretty hard to get people to believe in themselves. I mean, it has a lot to do with parental upbringing and just a person's natural human thinking. But Marlin has it, as did Geraldine Ferraro, Colin Powell, whomever you want to talk about that succeeds as a first or pioneer.
Let's take a call now on Midday. Gerald in Baltimore with your story. Thank you for joining our show. Go right ahead, Gerald. Yep.
How are you?
Good.
Thank you for the opportunity. I am the first black person ever to get a PhD in sociology from the University of Delaware. And I was wondering if he could comment on that, particularly knowing that the chairman of the department at the time referred to me with the N-word. And the other students in the class, they couldn't believe it themselves that the chairman of the department would call me that.
And I mean, may I ask, what was the occasion or the context when that occurred, Gerald?
We were in the classroom, graduate class, PhD class, and I made a remark about how all of the theories dealing with crime always put black people at a disadvantage in terms of committing crime. Mm-hmm. And the department chair said, well, you know, Gerald, everybody has their NIGGERS, to make me think that I was the University of Delaware's NIGGER.
So, but you somehow got through and got your degree?
Yes, I did.
Did you complain about the chairman?
Yes, I did. And that was one of the reasons why I think I was allowed to get through, because they didn't want a suit to follow about the chairman of the department calling me an NIGGER.
What year was this, Gerald?
I graduated in 1985, and me being referenced to with the N-word was in 1983.
It's an interesting story. I mean, you it's an odd story. It's an odd twist on what we're talking about here. But you were the first. Was this repeatedly pointed out to you that you were the first African American to be going for a PhD in specifically sociology at specifically the University of Delaware?
Yes, because the University of Delaware was under court order desegregation. Mm-hmm. You know, Delaware had a dual system of education. They had the University of Delaware, the white school, and Delaware State, the black school. But Delaware State did not have a PhD program in sociology.
Well,
how did you? Let me ask you something. Aside from the incident that you described, which it doesn't sound very like you remember it with any. Well, never mind. I mean, how did you feel going through this situation? And I wonder why you're calling us with this story in particular, with the story about what the chairman said.
Well,
how did you feel about it? Why did you continue at that school? Did you think about transferring?
My understanding is that this radio program is dealing with the first black quarterback in the NFL. Well, I'm the first black sociologist, University of Delaware.
Yeah, I understand, but you came up with this story about a very negative experience, as negative a thing as you could hear in that setting, and I just wonder why you continued there. Did you ever consider transferring to another school because of that incident?
No, I did not.
May I interject here? Gerald, this is a perfect example of part of the syndrome. You have to make such decisions. You experienced something that was terrible. It doesn't matter what year it was and what college it was, but the fact that it was in a sociology program is utterly amazing, because, as you know, sociologists study these kinds of things. But what we have here is an example of, here you are as a first, you have to evaluate, do I leave the school? Do I go to that person's boss? Do I forget it? Do I talk to my other students? And that's going to embarrass you to talk to. All of these things are can be part of the syndrome. Okay, there's no specific formula. That's part of the syndrome. It can raise doubts within you. I think that's appalling that happened. But the fact that it did happen, the fact that you were intelligent, the fact that you had to have stamina and you made it, just as Marlin Briscoe. He made it in football. He had to make some changes, but he finally made it and became an All-Pro. And
did you hear other stories like this, Norman Davis, when you were interviewing the folks?
Oh, yes. Yes, I did.
I mean, that blatant like that?
Yes. Some were that blatant. There was a woman that I interviewed. She was the first Jewish, not the first, but one of the first Jews to graduate from a small Catholic college. And her experience was very positive in the college, but when she had her first job at one of the major universities in town, she experienced anti-Semitism and so forth. And pretty much most of the people, even one of the people I interviewed, he's Asian. He was involved in the civil rights movement back in the 60s. People wanted to know, the civil rights movement had two kinds of people: black people, white people, northerners, southerners, fair people, and unfair people. And here he was as an Asian. He just believed strongly in this movement, and he was continually asked by whites and blacks. Why do you care? Yeah, he cared simply because he was human and he wanted to be a part of it, but he was always being questioned as not fitting the prototype for someone working in civil rights.
Let's take another call. Yvonne in Baltimore, you're on Midday next. Welcome to our show.
Hi, how are you today?
Good, thanks. Go ahead with your story, please.
All right, my story is that I was the first black teacher in a major city school in this country. I had graduated, and I went to college, I graduated, and I integrated a school. Now, when I went to the Board of Education, the personnel person told me, you're going to integrate this school. I've also had the experience of integrating another school's teaching staff. I integrated teaching staff. But the thing that I found common between both schools is every kid in the school knows your name. It's like everybody knows your name. Why do you teach fifth grade and the first grader know your name? I know why. It's because your parents taught. But even as the thing that I found most discouraging is that there were still black people that did not want me to teach their children, even though I was black.
Very interesting. So that's an example of even people of the same group may doubt you. Just as it's possible that some of those black ball players on Denver or other teams that Marlin played on might have doubted him for a moment or two.
Does that resonate with?
Correct. You see that the majority, unless those black players on my team were from traditionally black schools where they were used to having a black quarterback, you still had to prove to black players who played, in the Big Ten, the Big Eight, and whatever, prove to them that you could play the position as well as white players. So, I empathize with the young lady we're talking to.
Marlin Briscoe, please tell us, how do you spend your days today? What are you up to in California?
Well, basically, I was with the Boys and Girls Club for 12 years and recently retired. So I have a co-ownership in a storage business and football camp, which is very well attended. I'm revitalizing that. And there's a movie coming out on the story of my life based on the book. And so I'm doing some promotional work for that.
And we're speaking.
I'm enjoying life, and I'm trying to shoot that the elusive 70-something on the golf course.
Oh.
So that's my biggest task to date.
Well, thank you very much for being with us. It was a pleasure to get to speak with you, Marlin Briscoe. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And as Norm Davis said, he and Marlin Briscoe are speaking about this very topic. And Norman Davis's website is theblackquarterbacksyndrome.com. That's the title of his book, The Black Quarterback Syndrome, How to Succeed as a First or Pioneer in an Organization, also with some helpful information about how to support those who are breaking barriers. But his website is the title of the book, all strung together, theblackquarterbacksyndrome.com. And just finally, Norman Davis, we're just about out of time here. It's still very relevant today. People are still breaking barriers. There are still firsts out there.
There are more than I realize. I wrote this book for middle managers, people in the middle of their careers and so forth, but I'm discovering that there's still people graduating from college right now who are finding themselves. I have a friend whose son was in an advertising agency in Chicago, the first person and the only one working in this particular advertising agency. Women are... See, what I've found also, there's a correlation between the amount of education you get, the amount of intelligence you have, and how much individualism you have and adventurism that you have, that you're likely to be a first, second, third, or fourth, or pioneer if that's your personality.
Well, thank you so much for visiting with us today, Norman Davis, who teaches management at Albertus Magnus College in New Haven. Again, his book, The Black Quarterback Syndrome, his website, theblackquarterbacksyndrome.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. That's our Midday for today. We're back for tomorrow's show, Midday Friday, the News Review, and Midday on the Law with attorneys Jim Astrachan and Julie Rubin. So have a nice afternoon and evening, and I'll see you again tomorrow.
The executive producer of Midday is Vanessa Eskridge. Our associate producer is Michael Hemowitz. The director and engineer is Tom Welch. Our interns are Nicholas Denard, Rachel Cohn, and Theo Donet. You can follow Midday on Twitter and Facebook. Podcasts of all programs are available at wypr.org. Dan Rodrick's column appears in the Baltimore Sun. This is 88.1 WYPR, your NPR news station.